The Innkeeper's Account of the Christmas Story. They think I'm some kind of cruel, heartless landlord. Someone must have told them that. But they're wrong, just plain wrong. And it's time to set the record straight, once and for all. People say I'm an innkeeper. I suppose you'd call it an inn. To us, it's just a big house. My grandfather Joshua built it back when his trading business was at a peak, and he built it big enough to fit all 14 children. Well, a few years ago, the missus and I were rattling around in that big house, kids grown up and all, and we were thinking maybe we could take in a few travellers. Rachel has always been mighty good in the kitchen, so we just let out word that we'd take people in. And they started to come. Every night we'd have a person or two, sometimes more. People would always come back when they came back to town again. They did like Rachel's lamb stew. Then came that blankety-blank census the governor thought up. Taxation, pure and simple it was. People from all over the province flooded into the town that week. They filled us clean up. Rachel and I slept in the main room where we always do, and we started putting guests in the other 3 rooms. They just kept coming. Then we doubled up 2 or 3 families to a room, and still they kept coming. Finally, when we had filled the main room with 4 families plus Rachel and me, we started turning people away. I must have gotten in and out of bed 10 times that night, stumbling over bodies to get to the door. No more room, no more room. Come back in the morning. We'll have a couple of families leaving then. Come back then. They'd mutter something and head back to their party. Some would sleep somewhere next to a house under a shelter of a blanket. You see, I just couldn't make any more room. That's the honest truth. But I did make room for one couple. Joseph was a burly man with big arms and strong hands, down from Nazareth, I think he said. He wouldn't take no for an answer. I told him several times, no, I'm sorry, and he told me again about his little Mary. Well, when I saw his little Mary, she wasn't very little. She was just about as pregnant as a woman can get. Poor thing, she was awfully pale. When Joseph was pleading, I saw her grab her tummy in pain, and I knew I couldn't let her have the baby outside in the wind and the sleet. The barn, that would just have to do, I told myself, and led them and their donkey out back. Now it was pretty crowded, so I shooed several animals into the pen outside to make room in the dry one. Joseph said, "We are grateful, sir." Then with a serious look he asked me, "Do you know where I can find a midwife in these parts? We might need her tomorrow or the next day." That man didn't know much about having babies, that was plain enough to see. I ran to Aunt Sarah's house and pounded on the door until her husband came. "One of the travellers is having a baby," I told him. "I'll wait while Aunt Sarah gets dressed." I stopped a moment to catch my breath. "And tell her to hurry." By the time we got back to the barn, Joseph had little Mary settled on some soft, clean hay, wrapped up in a blanket, wiping her brow, and was speaking softly to her. Aunt Sarah sent me to get my Rachel, and then they pushed Joseph and me out of the barn. "This ain't no place for men," they said. We waited outside the shelter of the barn for hours. It seemed like hours. Well, all of a sudden, we hear a little cry. "You've got a baby boy. Aunt Sarah was saying as we peeped round the corner. She hands the young 'un to Rachel, and she wraps him up in those swaddling bands she had saved. He was a cute little thing, I can tell you. Well, Joseph goes over to Mary and gives her a big hug and a kiss on the cheek, and Rachel hands Mary the baby, and then comes over to me. Lantern was blowing almost out, and the donkeys were making a fuss, but the child was asleep in his mother's arms. That's how I left them, as I walked Aunt Sarah home. It was a chilly wind outside, and the sleet was still pouring. By the time I got back, Rachel was in bed, and I was about ready to put out the light, step over sleeping bodies, and get under the warm covers, when I heard some murmuring outside by the barn. I'd better check, I told myself. When I peeked in, I saw shepherds, ragged, smelly old shepherds. They were kneeling down on that filthy barn floor as if they were praying. The oldest one was saying something to Joseph about angels and the Messiah, and the rest of them just knelt there with their heads bowed. Some of them even had tears running down their faces. I coughed out loud and Joseph looked up. I was almost ready to run those thieving shepherds off, when Joseph motioned to me with his hand. "It's okay," he whispered. "They've come to see the Christ baby." The Christ baby? The Messiah? That was when I knelt too, and I watched and prayed, and I listened to the old shepherd recount his story of the angels and the heavenly glory, and the sign of a holy baby wrapped in swaddling bands to be found in a stable manger. My Lord, it was my stable where the Christ baby was born. My manger he rested in. My straw, my lamp, my wife Rachel assisting at his birth. The shepherds left after a while. Some of them leaned over and kissed the sleeping Christ child before they departed. I know I did. I'll always be glad I made room in the barn for that family, that holy family. You see, I'm not some mean innkeeper. I was there. I saw him. And do you know, years later that boy came back to Bethlehem as an adult, and this time he was telling about the kingdom of God. Oh, I believe in him. I tell you, I was there. And mark my words, if you'd seen what I'd seen, you'd be a believer too.